Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 110 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a half-lit, empty stage. As the audience continues to filter in, a man with a hat on and a pipe in his mouth enters and begins to set out a table and a few chairs. He waits until the last of the audience is settled and the house lights go down. He then tells us the name of the play, its author, the director, and several of the actors by name. He also tells us that we are in Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, and it is just before dawn on the 7th of May, 1901. Another day's begun in this town, in our town. For this is the opening of Thornton Wilder's enduring American classic, Our Town, whose quintessential portrait of rural America in a bygone time has somehow transcended its iconic American setting to become a universal meditation on the meaning of community and how we live our individual lives, wherever that may be. The play has been glibly dismissed by some as sentimental and parochial, but its grip is not just emotionally irresistible, it's unexpectedly profound, deepened by its surprisingly radical form and its provocative philosophical themes. As the critic John Lahr put it, the play manages to conjure both the commonplace and the cosmic. Our Town first previewed in Princeton and Boston before opening on Broadway in February 1938 to mixed critical response, but enthusiastic audiences. Its popularity was confirmed by immediate exceptional demand from professional and amateur companies for rights to perform the play, and it has been a staple of school, amateur, and stock performance ever since. In fact, according to Lahr, writing in the introduction to the Penguin edition of the play is performed somewhere in the world every day. It has recently completed a sellout run in the first production of the new Welsh National Theatre, with Michael Sheen headlining as the stage manager, a role that has been performed by Wilder himself, as well as by all-American icons such as Henry Fonda, Paul Newman, and Alan Alda. Our Town won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1938, making Wilder the first writer to win the award for both fiction and drama, and playwright Edward Albee described it as the greatest American play ever written. So I'm very excited to have the chance to add Our Town to the Play Podcast catalog. And I'm privileged to be joined today by someone who knows it exceptionally well. Howard Sherman is the author of Another Day's Begun, Thornton Wilder's Our Town in the 21st Century, in which he not only gives a brief introduction to the origins of the play, but also collates more than 100 personal interviews with theater artists who have performed in or produced the play within this century. The voices of these practitioners provide a fascinating insight into the workings of the play, as well as being a moving tribute to its enduring power. Welcome, Howard. Thanks so much for joining me on the Play Podcast.
It's a pleasure, Douglas.
So you said in the postscript in your book that before you embarked on the book, you would not have said that Our Town was one of your favorite plays. But after completing the interviews with the people that had been involved, you said it certainly was. What stands out, I wanted to know, as the most abiding things you learned or took away about the play from your work on the book?
I think what I learned in working on the book and figuring out how to frame the book was that it is a play which works upon the audience and upon the people who are in it. That the experience of engaging deeply with the play, which I experienced doing the book, gives one an appreciation for it that simply watching it once might not completely achieve. That there's much more to this play than meets the eye. It is deceptively simple. And I think when people think about the play, they only think about the first two acts, and they think about the quaintness of it. And I think, to a degree, productions over the years have leaned into the quaintness and bypassed the really experimental and meta-theatrical elements that have helped to make it timeless and not dated.
That's absolutely true. I mean, you would get an impression perhaps from the first two acts, just seeing it, as you said, for the first time, that there's a kind of Norman Rockwell portrait of bygone America, sentimental. But as we're going to talk about, there is much more to that. And it's interesting you say that. That is one of the things I took away from reading your book, was how deeply the actors did get involved and moved by their experience of being in the play, how much they explored their own characters in depth and recognized something about things that had happened in their own life in the play, which speaks, I guess, in some ways to the universality of the play, which we'll also touch on. I was really struck that it generated such deep emotions in the cast who performed in it, and how they also became a community in a sense as a result of doing so. And I know theater is a collaborative effort, but it somehow mirrors what actually goes on in the play as well.
Absolutely. I mean, every production creates a family, and ideally companies bond in interesting ways. I think our town, because of what it asks people to grapple with, the themes of the play, forces out even more about one's personal experience in order to underpin these relatively thinly drawn characters, then creates a bond that goes beyond simply that which is necessary to produce a play.
That's absolutely right. And we're going to talk about the characters a little bit. And as you say, they're thinly drawn in some respects. But it's a play very much about life and death in its most basic terms. So I think it can't but affect us at that level as well. Can you tell us a bit about who Thornton Wilder was, and also where our town fits into or comes from in his life and career?
Well, I don't pretend to be a Wilder expert. I would say to those who want to know more about Wilder, Penelope Niven's biography really is the definitive place to look. But Wilder was a classicist. He was a teacher and initially a novelist. You mentioned that he was the first person to win the Pulitzer in 2 different categories. He won a Pulitzer in 1927 for The Bridge at San Luis Rey, and then shifted for a period into theater. He loved theater. Initially, he did an adaptation of Hedda Gabler that was produced. It may have been A Doll's House. It was one of the Ibsens that he had adapted. But when he did Our Town in the 30s, opening in early 1938, he was already recognized as a public intellectual, as I like to say. He was a known quantity stepping into another field, so not exactly a first-time playwright coming out of nowhere. And he had very high-level education. His dad was a diplomat. He spent some time living in Asia and was educated in American schools over there. So he was a very smart guy who obviously had capabilities in multiple fields.
Yeah, he's a very cultured man, as you say. He went to Princeton, and in fact, he started writing, I think, plays and novels even when he was at university, and became quite famous with the publication of his second novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, which won the Pulitzer, as you mentioned.
I neglected he'd written some one-acts that had gotten some attention before Our Town, but one-acts don't land in the popular awareness the same way a Broadway play does.
That's right. Yes, because he wrote several of them in the 1930s leading up to Our Town, in which some of the techniques and things that we see in Our Town he was working through.
Exactly.
I was struck by how cultured he was, in that he traveled frequently all over Europe, visiting the theater and opera wherever he goes. He spoke 4 languages, was incredibly well read, as you say, in the classics. People he met on his travels: Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Thomas Mann, Freud and Picasso even. So this was, as you say, an intellectual of some note.
In fact, there's an entire book of his correspondence with Gertrude Stein. They were so close. He wrote to her as he was writing Our Town. You can see their correspondence as the play was developing.
Some of that background, I thought, Howard, was interesting. You mentioned the fact that it seems simple on the surface, but he was so literate and so considered that he knew exactly what he was doing with the way he constructed this play and the depth of ideas that he wanted to express. So I think that's a clue in a way. Who he is a clue that there's going to be more to this play, as you said at the beginning, than meets the eye. The play was first premiered in 1938. He was writing it in 1937. What was happening in the world in the 1930s that may have inspired Wilder to write this play, would you say?
I think there were many inspirations, but I think the important thing, again, in contrast to the simplicity and ostensibly homespun nature of the play, is while he did do work on the play at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, he also spent a significant amount of time working on the play while he was in Europe. And if you were in Europe in the mid-1930s, you were dealing with the rise of Hitler. And so you contrast what was going on politically in the world and the run-up to World War II was underpinning the world as he wrote this piece about, in part, the value of home and community.
Yes, I was going to say it's a response in a positive sense to what was going on in Europe. It's kind of presentation of alternative values and wanting to promote hope for America in some way.
Or whether it was cautionary, because he does in the play reference war several times. So the specter of war and war's effect on people in these communities is absolutely written into the play, but in such a manner as to not be directly about what was specifically happening in the 1930s, but as a reminder of the impact of war even on the smallest of communities.
Yes, there's a reference to the newspaper boy. The newspaper boy that we see throwing newspapers in 1901 goes on to die in the First World War, I think. And it may be that when we come to talk about the final act, that some of this is a kind of prophetic foreshadowing of what's coming.
There's constant foreshadowing in this play of mortality. I mean, when we talk about its homespun character, where it's deceptive is if you're not looking for it, you don't realize necessarily how quickly in the play Wilder is talking about loss. There are characters who he speaks of even before you see them, and you're told about when they died and how they were remembered. There is indeed the paperboy who dies in World War I, who had gone to college and all that education for nothing. The sense of loss pervades our town progressively. When you first start hearing it in the early acts, it goes right by you, and you don't realize the degree that he's setting you up for something else. It's incredibly shrewdly constructed in that way, that if you look for those things, what takes place in the play is highly metatheatrical and even fantastical third act. The seeds have been planted really from the very first pages.
That's absolutely true. It's subtle but accumulative.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that for listeners who are not familiar with the play, I wonder if we could give a brief summary of the plot of the play, such as it is. I think this is slightly tricky, but between us, maybe we can have a go.
Well, it is tricky. On the most basic level, it is simply the story of life in a small town, two families that live next door to one another, each of whom have a teenager, one boy, one girl, who find that they are meant for one another, who marry. And you see glimpses of their family life and of their courtship and of their wedding as the play progresses until in the third act it takes a darker turn. And I try not to talk about the third act because, as familiar as many people may be with this play, if you've never seen it before, I think the journey of discovery is important.
Well, okay, I understand that sentiment, but there's no way we're going to avoid this.
Oh, I've gotten good at it, but if you force me, we'll have to cope with it.
Yes.
But in the third act, there is loss. A character that you have followed, we suddenly learn, has passed. and what that effect is on the community. But that's the most basic level of the play. The play is framed, you've already mentioned the character of the stage manager. The stage manager is this very enigmatic character. He's the narrator of the piece and has by far the most lines of dialogue in the entire play. And he's constantly taking time between the scenes of life in this town, Grover's Corners, to tell us about the town, to tell us about things we might look for in what's going on, to give us information that we wouldn't otherwise have just watching scenes played out. And that's where I talk about the meta-theatrical aspect of it. It's perhaps reductive to say it this way, but I've come to think of the play as a TED Talk about the value of life. And the scenes between the characters, George and Emily, our young lovers, their parents, are all demonstrations of things that the stage manager, perhaps a stand-in for Wilder himself, especially since Wilder did play the role on and off for a number of years, wanted us to know. And the character himself, in a way, isn't a character. The stage manager has no name. The stage manager is never referred to as the stage manager in the play. He is simply this character who is there on stage guiding us through the story. He has no beginning, he has no end, he has no story of his own or character arc. And that's quite unusual to give someone that much prominence and that little detail for the amount of stage time and the amount of information that they convey to us.
You're right. One of the most striking elements of the play is this meta-theatricality, and the stage manager is the narrator. As I said at the beginning, he is the man who comes out and starts introducing what's going on. And as I've said, he very explicitly says, this is a play you're about to see. And then he sets the scene, describes the town, introduces characters, orchestrates the running of the whole thing. He interrupts scenes to give us more information, moves time along. He says, now we're going to skip ahead a few hours, hurries the characters and actors, even thanks them after a scene, and fills in playing some of the roles. One of the questions I wrote down here was, who is he? Because, as you say, there's no personal story. Is he a member of this community? Did he live in this community? Or an outsider? Or is he a godlike figure? He seems to know everything. He even knows the future. So who is he?
We don't know, and I don't think we're ever going to know, who the stage manager is. And it's not necessarily important that we do. But as our guide to the play, they have enormous influence. And it's interesting. We do keep saying he. And as the play was written, it was a he. When it was originally produced, Frank Craven obviously was male. And as you read off some of the names of people who played the role, famous actors who played the role, it's been many years since it has been strictly a male role. Women started playing the role at least in the 1970s. The role has been played by actors of color going back many years. The way in which that role is cast is hugely important on how we perceive the show. But I think there's another question about the stage manager, and it's one that David Cromer, who directed a very well-received production which played in multiple cities in the U.S. and did play in London in 2014. When I spoke with David, David said the first question that he had to tackle in working on the show was, well, where is this guy? Is this guy in Grover's Corners? Is this guy in a theater in 1938? I phrase this when I do workshops with high school classes. I often like to start by asking them, when is the stage manager? Is the stage manager in 1938 when the play was written? Is the stage manager in whatever year it is when we go to see the play? Because after all, the play is written in such a way that the stage manager tells you you're in the theater you're in, watching this play with the actors you're going to see in the play. And so there's something that forces an immediate contemporaneity about the production. And I think all of those elements brought to the stage manager, because the stage manager is in many ways a blank slate, can have an enormous impact on how the play is perceived in the time and place that it's being produced.
I'm glad you picked up on that, because I feel like he or she is speaking to us today in the theater live, as it were. As we've said, he makes references to the specifics of the production. And he clearly possesses a knowledge of, in the play at least, of events that occur in the future beyond the date that the play is set, as we referenced in terms of reference to the World War, and he talks about the characters' future lives as well. And I wondered what you think the effect is on the audience of this. What impact does this have on the way we receive the play?
I think the impact is enormous. Having seen it done with a variety of stage managers, it absolutely makes a difference, simply if it's a man or a woman taking you into this story. Wilder wanted the stage manager's delivery to be very dry, very straightforward. The stage manager is not necessarily your friend. The stage manager is not necessarily a warm, welcoming presence. The stage manager is there to deliver the facts about a lot of things. We like to know a lot of things about people in Grover's Corners, and he knows a lot of things about Grover's Corners. There are some who think that the stage manager is God. There are elements in the script which suggest that's probably not the case, because he makes reference to a higher authority at times. But is he Wilder's version, although it predated it, of Clarence the Angel in It's a Wonderful Life? Is he some sort of omniscient form? Is he of Grover's Corners? Is this the only town he knows? He does say it's our town, but is it possible that there are other towns? None of these have definitive answers. And so what's great, and I think one of the many things that keeps the play viable nearly 100 years after it was written, is there's this enormous space for a director and for an actor to fill. And those choices take us through. So when you go to see an Our Town with Michael Sheen, you are guided into the play with your knowledge of Michael Sheen. How he may perform the role may then transform where it's being done. If the role were cast with a black woman, I very much would love to see an American actress named Anna Devere Smith play the stage manager. I think the play would be radically different, fascinating. And indeed, the casting of the town. Certainly when the play was written, and this was a play for an all-white cast, and it was cast as that community might have been. But again, since the 1960s, at least in the U.S., there have been multiracial productions of the play. And the play was getting done in other countries by other races and other ethnicities within just a couple of years of being written. So the play transcends the whiteness and the homogeneity of what Grover's Corners would have been, or what the original Broadway production would have been. And all of that goes to then, as I say, fill in the things which are only sketched by Wilder. He doesn't go deep into facts about these people that would make it harder for us to accept watching a production that is being done by a multiracial cast.
Yeah. It's fascinating you're saying that all those questions that one can ask about who the stage manager is, to which there are no answers. And in some ways, it doesn't matter, and there never are going to be any answers. But the position he adopts, the perspective we end up with, is hugely significant. One of the things I thought is that it does give the whole thing an energy as well, a sense of live things being created, because he is orchestrating the play in present time. It's very much a live performance happening now under his direction in some respects. And I thought it was fascinating, I think this came out in your book, that when Paul Newman did the role in 2002, he said that he wanted to give the audience the idea that his narration might change every night, that it was that live, that he was responding to the way it went then, or even to tell the story differently. And it's a fascinating idea, isn't it? Because you have this sense throughout that what you're seeing could be slightly arbitrary. It's a selection of scenes. Is the stage manager staged these scenes in some way, decided what were going to be shown of the ongoing life of this place and people? And maybe, if you came back tomorrow, as Paul Newman suggests, it would be different.
Which is a wonderful idea. I mean, I think, if Alan Ayckbourn had written Our Town, then there might be alternate scenes for alternate nights, and you might see different things. But I do think what Wilder did was choose only the most essential scenes to tell us about what he wanted us to know. The George and Emily romance happens in 3 scenes. It's very quick. We're not watching a romantic comedy. We are seeing an archetypal small town romance happen, and we accept it because of the skill of the playwright, but we don't need to know much more. And if one looks at earlier versions of Our Town that Wilder wrote before he got to the final version, there was more. And what's very telling is how much he pared away. In an earlier version, George talked about wanting to run for office.
Oh my gosh.
Which is sort of fascinating and unexpected, but unnecessary, and it's gone. There was stuff about Mr. Morgan, the druggist, moving away from Grover's Corners and what his life became when he moved to California. It's gone. Well, they make perfect sense, and they give you more about the character. They give you more telling. And so it's fascinating, and if you can find an early published edition of the play, some of that made it into the initial published edition of the play. So it's fascinating on a dramaturgical and an intellectual level, but when you realize that the play was a paring away to the basics.
It becomes stripped down to archetypal in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what speaks to us about its universality. And speaking of stripped down, one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well is about the lack of set. Because Wilder was very deliberate about this. I mean, there are instructions, obviously, in the text about the set with a few chairs and table and a couple of ladders at one point. But he had very strong views, didn't he, about the conventional nature of theater and that this is an alternative to that. What were his views about set, and what is the effect of this treatment that he comes up with?
I think it's a reflection of the paring away that I was just talking about, the paring away of the text and the paring away of the scenery. He didn't want us to focus on anything other than the essentials that we needed. As I mentioned, he did spend some time in the Far East when he was younger, so he would have been familiar with Asian styles of theater, which did not have the kind of elaborate scenery one would be expecting on Broadway. So that could have influenced him. But, even as you began this podcast and you started describing the way the play began, you skipped the first 4 words of the script. And the first 4 words of the script are no curtain, no scenery. He wanted it to simply be a story told in an empty theater, and that there was only a need to conjure just as much as was necessary to tell the story and nothing more. I think as time has gone on, people who do the play sometimes feel a need to go against those wishes, and they may find their way to it, in ways that maintain a simplicity, but it's really hard to just put a play on a bare stage and get people to accept it. By the same token, my gosh, talk to some of the actors who've had to do the mime work, the women who play the moms, who are required by the text to mime the preparation of breakfast. And they'll tell you how maddening it is to learn all of that motion and then get it so ingrained into them that then they can just worry about the dialogue while they're going through their motions. But if people are rattling pots and pans and plates and forks and knives, you're not listening. You're not listening to the words. And so it just strips all of that away.
So yes, as you say, there's no props really. The actors have to mime. As we mentioned, they specifies a table, a few chairs, and a couple of ladders. And I thought that what's interesting, having seen the recent production as well, which is it's just very inventive with what they have, and also results in producing a great sense of energy and fluency on the stage because they are creating the whole thing on the fly. Also, scenes in different parts of the town can take place simultaneously without worrying about setting up location.
Yep.
I read that he railed against this naturalism of the conventional set, that it limited the imagination. He wanted us to imagine where we were. And I think that's important too, isn't it? Because it allows this to be any place in some way, this town.
I think what's also worth noting is that he does not have a prescription about lighting. And lighting can create space. Lighting can create mood. In the era in which he was working, you often had shows where either there wasn't a credit for lighting design or lighting design was simply part of the responsibility of the set designer. And now there's an enormous amount that can be done to change our perception of space and mood through lighting without in any way violating what Wilder put in the script.
That's absolutely right, because actually the Welsh National Theatre production, the lighting was absolutely beautiful and very, very effective. So there are other tools in the theatrical arsenal, so to speak. I want to ask you about time in the play. We touched on this in the role of the stage manager, because the stage manager is speaking to us from some time in the future. So we are looking back. It also jumps around at times. And it gives the whole thing a kind of nostalgic feel in a way, doesn't it? But also a bit sort of ethereal, maybe.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that he ever is really speaking to us from the future. He is speaking to us, it would seem, from the theater that you're in at the time that you are. And he does look back to the past. So it's only the future if you think about the Grover's Corners scenes as being the setting of the play. And so that immediately sets up that discussion about when is the stage manager. But we also have to remember that the past has changed as the play has aged. When this play was written, it was 1938. And if the stage manager was a guy in a theater in 1938 telling you this story, going back to 1904, 1905, 1913, he was going back 25 years. He was not taking us to antiquity. 2 decades is a generation, and it's a little more than that, but it was still something that would be in people's memories. In fact, for theater goers, presumably in their 30s, 40s, 50s, this would be their childhoods that we're taking them back to. And even if their childhoods were urban and not rural like the play, all of the things that were happening would be in common memory. What has happened with time, in one way, with our town, and it goes back to the issue of interpretation, is that what was once the recent past has now become antiquity. And it's one of the great pitfalls, I think, of doing the show today, is that if you are obsessed with recreating 1901, 1904, 1905, and so on, then you anchor the play as a true period piece in a way that it was not in its original perception. So I think that's an element of time that simply the progression of a classic has forced on it, and it requires choices in another area, which we've not spoken about, is that there is no prescription against costumes in the play. And what those costumes look like, how people are dressed, how we perceive them, can really have an effect on how we relate to the time of this. Is this now looking back 100 years because the play is coming to be 100 years old? Or should the production be thinking about how not to make it quite so old-timey and picture postcardy, which is what some people like to condemn the play with, but rather something that may still have details. We can't get past some things like the philo system of raising chickens and the advent of the automobile being written into the play, but do we need to emphasize it? So that's one issue. Another issue about time in the play is really the core of what Wilder wants us to get at, and I may be jumping ahead, but the play brings us to a statement in the third act. Do any human beings realize life while they live it every minute? And the play is fundamentally an exhortation on the audience to be more present in their lives, to be more appreciative of their lives as they are happening. That is an issue of time. Time is constantly discussed in the play. What time is it? How long have things taken? It's about what do we do with our time on Earth, and do we appreciate our time on Earth while it is happening? So I think time is incredibly central to this play. And again, on a close watching or a close reading of the script, you realize how often time comes up in the dialogue.
Yes. Well, there's a lot to get our teeth into there. As you say, it's important thematically, but I wondered also about the fact that it's kind of elusive because it's the past as well. It has that sense of memory to it as well. In fact, I think the stage manager says somewhere, now you remember, let's remember together. So it's got that kind of elegiac tone, but elusiveness as well, which is interesting because of its uncertainty. As memory, of course, is just that, is always partial and uncertain. And that seems to feed into some of the themes of the play, how we understand or not our lives as we're living them, as you've just said, or what we make of the past.
Well, when the stage manager specifically says, now take yourself back, what he's trying to do is strip away everything that's happened in your life and try to get the audience to collectively remember when they fell in love. In that case, yes, it is peeling away the years, but however old you are, can you remember the sort of moments when you did finally realize you were meant for someone? And maybe it was your first love, maybe it wasn't the love that you married, but again, this is, as I say, the TED Talk characteristic of the play. It is the stage manager talking not as a character and not to other people on stage with him, but to the people in the seats, and trying to get them to a place where they can receive the things he wants to share with them.
Yes, and which we universally relate to.
One hopes so.
Well, and also, as we mentioned at the beginning, that the cast members in your book seem to.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what happens within the book, I always say I'm the beneficiary of the generosity of about 115 people who spent time telling me about their experience of living in Grover's Corners. The vast majority of them could immediately remember what it was out of their own life that resonated within the play. What came out over time was this way in which the people who worked on the play connected it to their own lives. Some about love, some about loss. I remember talking with participants in a youth theater production, and I wondered, these are young kids. How much did they connect with this play? And I have to say, I was put in my place. when a 13-year-old said to me, well, my closest friend was killed in a drive-by a year ago. So realizing that someone who's 12 or 13 can do this play and have an appreciation for what it has to say about mortality was eye-opening.
That's a very helpful segue, because I was going to come on and ask you about some of the philosophical themes of the play and some of the darkness. And we touched on the suggestion that it can be sentimental or nostalgic, but actually the play is far darker than it may first appear, as I think you said near the beginning. People die, and there is grief on display, of course, very profound grief on display in the play. So that death, as you said at the very beginning, is introduced very early on. And I think we have to talk about this amazing third act in a bit more detail, Howard, because the play, as you said, takes this extraordinary turn. One of the main characters dies, and we open the third act, and we're in the cemetery. And we have this extraordinary imaginative conceit where the dead stand as if above their graves and speak. I mean, I don't know whether I'm going to avoid saying it's Emily who dies.
Well, I guess you didn't.
I didn't, no. She actually arrives in the graveyard having newly died in childbirth, which in itself is a shock. This is a archetypal young romance, as we've just been describing, and it turns tragic. And the third act, though both structurally and in subject, is an extraordinary transition and surprise, possibly. I wondered, would it have been a shock to the first audiences to witness this third act?
I think it's still a shock to some audiences if you've never seen it before. That's why I tend to try to be as vague as I can about what happens in the third act. I think even people who've seen Our Town before tend to talk about moments in the first two acts, particularly the soda shop scene where George and Emily realize they really are meant to be together. And they think about the sweetness. And I think people, in some cases, just emotionally have to block the power of the third act because it's so wrenching. And I say this as somebody who twice saw the play and just completely melted down into tears at the third act. And it's not as if I didn't know what was coming. Again, in both cases, I think it had to do with loss in my own life, and that watching these scenes triggered that, but it connected me to the play in an extraordinary way. The third act is absolutely dark. You know, you referenced Edward Albee in your introduction, saying this is the great American play. Edward also said it was, when done correctly, a brutal play. Nobody's putting that in the advertising, and it's certainly not when people think or talk about Our Town how they describe it. But the fact is it is a deeply emotionally resonant play about mortality and loss, and set against the exhortation to therefore appreciate what we have while we have it and pay attention to even the small things in life, even the simplest days. I think the third act will always hit hard, even for people who know the play, if they have invested in all the little boring details of the first two acts, and I've certainly heard it described that way. And the lack of event in the first two acts is all set up for the impact of that third act.
Correct. And while you were talking, I was thinking about the characters and how we don't get a lot of depth about Emily or George, the central couple, but we feel very strongly when she passes, and then her distress when she arrives in this afterlife, this afterworld. And I wanted to ask you just if we can somehow explain what this afterworld he's creating is, because we have these characters who died speaking to each other, and they're in some kind of purgatory, but it's not a terrible place. It's not scary. It's not alarming. And in fact, they welcome Emily into it in some way. But where are they? What is this state?
We don't know exactly what the state is. I would hesitate to use purgatory because of the negative connotations of it. They're in a way station, in my mind. They're in a place where they're waiting to where the earthly part of them burns away until they are ready to move on, and that the longer they are there, they separate more and more from the earth in different ways. And in most productions, the actors are urged to be calm, not to be who they were when portrayed in life, with one exception. Simon Stimson, who is the alcoholic choirmaster, who is the real fly in the ointment in the world of Grover's Corners that we see, still hangs on to bitterness about his life. He is not as evolved yet as some of the others. And the others who are there chastise him for that, for not letting go.
Yes. He has not left his earthly life behind, his bitterness about his life. In fact, I should mention he killed himself because he was an alcoholic, but there's a question about why he's an alcoholic.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is something that one can play in production. There are references in the text to he has had undisclosed troubles in his life.
Yep.
But there are also productions, aren't there, that have suggested it may be because he is queer. The doctor says that he was never meant for small town life or something like that.
Yep.
Suggests that somehow he's not going to be accepted. Who he is wasn't going to be accepted.
Yep.
Wasn't possible in that time or place. I don't know. That's not explicit in the text, I should say. But clearly he has an unhappiness. He hasn't shed that unhappiness. As you say, the others seem in some way to have let go of their earthly cares. But Emily, when she first arrives, of course she's just new here, is not at that stage, is she? She says, when does this feeling go away of being one of them? How long does it take to not regret being alive?
Yeah.
So she actually, in the plot, is allowed to return to life, and she chooses to go back to her 12th birthday, but discovers, because she's told that actually you can't go back there without knowing what's also to come in your life.
Yes, you simultaneously go back and you experience it, but you know everything that's yet to come, that there is a duality to it.
And that's an unsustainable position to be in, she discovers quite quickly, right?
She can't bear it. She breaks away when faced with actually engaging with her beloved father when he's about to enter the scene on the 12th birthday. That's it. She steps out. She says, I can't. Take me back, to the stage manager, who at that point has become her guide into that earlier life. That's where his otherworldly abilities seem to come into play, because he escorts her back to her 12th birthday.
But also that's where, as we go back to what you were saying earlier, where she has the revelation, which is one of the enduring messages that audiences take away from the play and that you referred to, that she recognizes how quickly time's passing and that we don't appreciate how fortunate and wonderful, I guess, it is to be alive at the time that we're living it. As you said, do any human beings ever realize life while they live it, every minute? To which the stage manager simply answers, no.
Well, he says no. The saints and poets, maybe. They do some. He allows that there are some people with a slightly more evolved sensibility who may be able to touch upon it. But yes, again, in the unconventional nature of the play, in the experimental, meta-theatrical aspects, to the degree this play has a climax, since it doesn't have a conventional plot, it has less of a climax than it has an epiphany. And that is the epiphany of the play. And from there, the play concludes relatively quickly. But that's all part of the structure of it. I want to come back to, if you don't mind, you talked about time. One of the things that struck me in the interviews that I did for the book, the final chapter is a production that I saw at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison, where it was done by incarcerated men, and 3 women were brought in to play Emily and the mothers. But talking to those men who were serving 20 and 30-year sentences and their relationship to time in the play, because they talked very much about how all they had was the ability to think about their life as they had lived it, because so long as they were in prison, they were outside of conventional time. And their understanding of the regret for not appreciating what they had.
Wow, yeah.
But a deep and profound appreciation for the play. And what I was saying earlier on about how we perceive the play, depending on, say, who is playing the stage manager, there is also something about how we see the play, depending on where we're seeing it. Now, granted, most people are not seeing the play in a maximum security prison. But as Emily is coming to her epiphany in Act 3, she has a line, people are all just shut up in little boxes, aren't they? And to hear that spoken in the visitor's room of a maximum security prison with a cast of men who have to be back in their cells about 30 minutes later, puts a resonance on that line in a way that Wilder probably never intended, but to this idea of how one perceives the play and one experiences the play when one is inside it, that line just leapt out at me that night.
Yes, I think he's meaning in a more general sense that we're all going around living inside our own heads, and this lack of appreciation of life minute to minute. Of course, it's a charge to us to think more closely about how we approach and appreciate life and other people in it. I was struck, I think it came in your book, that the actress Laura Ellsworthy, who played Emily at the Almeida in London in 2014, got a tattoo of every minute because she wanted to hang on to that idea. And Albee, again, said, when it is done properly, it makes us understand that if we don't live our lives fully and completely, we've wasted everything we have.
And it's impossible to live our lives every single minute aware. We can't stand outside of ourselves as it's happening. But if we can take the time to think about it, as I say, I think our town wants us to leave changed. Not because we've seen a story that made us laugh or cry or what have you, the way we react to theater, but wants us to leave thinking about our own life, not necessarily what we've just seen. And that makes it an unusual piece of theater. And I think, there's a reason. You can be glib and say the reason our town is done as often as it is, and it is done countless times, is, it's inexpensive. You don't need scenery. But I think the reason it continues to get done is because it does have this very specific message. And while now, 90 years on, you have to wade through the old-timiness of it and perhaps even try to minimize the old-timiness of it, that core belief of how do we appreciate what we have, how do we find life beautiful, is something that has not changed. And, there's a reason that Wilder invokes things like talking about going back to the Pleistocene and the ground on which the story is set, and why he takes us out at the end of Act 1 beyond Grover's Corners, beyond the United States, into the solar system, the Milky Way, and the mind of God, is because even in this tiniest little microcosm called Grover's Corners, it is just one dot in a vastly larger universe. And yet we still should find the value in where we are in that universe, is something that he hoped for. And he's, I think, pretty darn successfully done it. And again, the Americana of our town, some of which is in there, is not what's important. And the play would not be done internationally, would not have been done so many times over so many years, or have been done so quickly after its Broadway premiere in so many different countries. The play was being done, in Europe and even in Asia before World War II actually set in. And as soon as the war was over, our town started getting done again. If our town was about America, then Our Town would not be done the way it is, or ever would have been done the way it is. But like any great work of theater, it may have some cultural specificity, but if it was about the cultural specificity, it wouldn't travel. There is something greater in the message.
Yeah, it's true, because actually the Welsh production here, almost entire text is as per the original text, with references, as you say, to the descriptions of Grover's Corners in New England and the time it was set and all the rest. There is one exception where they reference names of Welsh mountains that are just outside town. I felt like we were in the Welsh town, even with the text that talks about the fact that we're in America. And the other point you made about the largest scheme of things, where it's set in the universe, so to speak. Of course, the stage manager at the very end comes back to this with this wonderful image where he looks up at the stars that are doing their old crisscross journeys in the sky. Scholars haven't settled the matter yet, but they seem to think there are no living beings up there, just chalk or fire. Only this one is straining away all the time to make something of itself. The strain's so bad that every 16 hours everybody lies down and gets a rest. And then he looks at his watch. It's 11 o'clock in Grosvenor Corners. You get a good rest too. Good night. And what I wanted to ask you about there was how we feel at the end of the play. We've seen death and been presented, in fact, with the idea that life could not only be over sooner than we know, but that within the mass of people in history, our individual lives may largely be forgotten. And we've talked about Simon Stimson has this tirade, bitter but quite cogent, about how badly we live and how selfish we can be. Do we come out thinking positively or darkly about our lives and the world? What do you reckon?
I have never come out of Our Town depressed. I have come out of Our Town a bit emotionally wrung out, but I do come out reminded that I've got to look at the better things. I've got to try to appreciate, what I have and who I have. Very much it is about who we have. Over the course of the play, we're constantly being told about characters' deaths before we've met the characters. We have characters who die in the play and just go away. Of course, so much is ultimately invested in the loss of Emily. A loss so painful that when they made the movie of it a couple of years later, Emily didn't die. The feeling was that in a film, you couldn't get away with that in a way you could in the theater. And it was Wilder himself, though he didn't write the screenplay, who gave his blessing to that ending. It certainly changes the play. But I do come away with perhaps having remembered people I've lost and thinking about how lucky I was to have them. And then trying to remember perhaps people who I haven't been in touch with lately, and maybe it's time for a call.
Yes, absolutely. I think when Simon Stimson has this outburst, Mrs. Gibbs, who's one of the dead, speaks straight to him, says, "Simon, that ain't the whole truth, and you know it." And it reminded me, Mrs. Soames, another character who's dead, said earlier, "My, wasn't life awful and wonderful?" And both are contained in the play, I would suggest. And I think mostly we come away with the positive power of Emily's invocation to live every minute, as well, I think, as the supporting power of community, which we see on display in the living and the dead, in fact, in the third act. And I think the title's interesting, isn't it? One of the resonances is that plural, our town. It's a possessive and plural that signals the idea of community. It's a shared place, which people in any community can relate to. And we've said somehow our town can be any town where we live together, and these lives can be any of our lives that we relate to what has happened. And I also thought it was interesting when he looks at his watch. Your book is entitled Another Day's Begun. The implication seemed to me that Grosvenor Corners will wake up again tomorrow and start all over again. This play will be done again, maybe tomorrow, in a slightly different version or whatever. Life continues.
Well, the title, which is simply a line from the play, it's what the stage manager says in Act 1 after he's sort of set the scene and is ready to start letting some scenes be enacted. But there's a quality of our town, and I think in the popularity of it, it's become true, Our town, in a way, is a reverse Brigadoon in that every day, this play, this town, these actions will start anew, whether it's the production that you're seeing or somewhere else. So instead of coming to life once every 100 years, our town, the play, this story of Grover's Corners, is told to us day in and day out in the same way. You know, it even makes you question, what are we seeing in each act and how do we perceive it, not simply in what's happening in the theater we might happen to be seeing it in, but where is it happening elsewhere in the world right now? Where else is this story being told? That's something that's grown on it. Sometimes, you know, I wonder whether those people in Act 3 who've passed away, well, they're going to rise up again tomorrow and tell you this story again tomorrow.
Yeah, it goes on. Howard, thank you so much. This has been, to use your phrase, a perfect TED Talk, I think. a bit longer than 10 minutes, but beautifully championed. Thank you very much. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do on the podcast, or one basically that's just a personal favorite. So I wonder if there's a play you would like to tell our listeners about that you just love.
Well, it's funny. When you posed that to me, the first thing that popped into my head is a fairly obscure play. And it's not like it's my favorite play by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one that hit me really hard. And I mention it only because I think it's been forgotten by time. And it's a play called This Story of Yours by John Hopkins. It's a British play from the late 60s. It was done at the Royal Court originally, and it's about a case of police brutality. And it was when I saw what I believe may have been the only U.S. production of it when I was probably in my late teens or early 20s at most, completely knocked me out. And just with all of the conversations around policing in the world, you know, there are so many plays, and some become timeless classics like Our Town, and some are of their moment, and some may only need to be of their moment. But I've always found it a fascinating piece. I've always wanted to see it tackled again. Interestingly enough, it also was made into a movie, again, little known, a movie called The Offense, starring Sean Connery.
Sounds fascinating. I've never heard of it, and I will go and look it up. Thank you very much. You're right. There are innumerable plays that probably should see another life.
So many plays, not enough stages.
I'll use that as a mantra. Thank you. Thank you, Howard. As the curtain falls on another day in Grover's Corners, how do we reflect on what we've seen? I feel that the power and depth of the play kind of sneak up on you. It seems at times too simple, but you begin to sense that it's asking profound philosophical questions, that it is about more than these individuals. It's about all of us, how we try to live and understand ourselves, our place in the world and history, the essential questions we ask by being human. As the stage manager declared, the play endures as a record of the way we were in our growing up and in our marrying and in our living and in our dying. It doesn't shirk from the darknesses and struggles that we cannot escape in a life, but it leaves us with both a consolation that we are not alone in failing to grasp ultimate meaning, and a charge that we try to properly appreciate the gift of life in each other. It is this sense of flawed but shared humanity that performers and audiences respond to in this play, in whatever town it is performed in. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.